Cornell Theological Seminary, and his master's and PhD in history at Johns Hopkins. He taught for 39 years at Grove City College. For many of these years, he also chaired the history department and coordinated the humanities core. Smith, who specializes in American religious history, is the author or editor of 20 books, including Faith and Presidency, From George Washington to George W. Bush, Heaven in the American Imagination, and Standing Strong, Grove City College's 150-year journey in faith, freedom, and the pursuit of excellence. His op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post, Newsweek, USA Today, and other major newspapers and magazines. In 2019, he was granted the title of Emeritus Professor. Smith is a fellow for faith and politics at the Institute for Faith and Freedom. He also is a parish associate at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. And our second speaker for the day is Dr. Jay Cost, the Gerald R. Ford Non-Residential Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on political theory, Congress, and elections. He is also a visiting scholar at Grove City College and a contributing editor to the Washington Examiner. He writes and speaks frequently on American elections, with special attention on placing contemporary trends in a historical context. His books include James Madison, America's First Politician, The Prince of Greatness, or The Price of Greatness, my apologies, Alexander Hamilton, and The Creation of American Oligarchy. Wow, I can't do English today. And A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of Political Corruption. Dr. J's next book, Democracy or Republic, The People and the Constitution, is due to be released later this year. Dr. Cost is a PhD and a master's in political science from the University of Chicago, nice school, and a BA in government and history from the University of Virginia. Thank you. Let's welcome Dr. Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. In my brief time today, I want to discuss two primary issues. How can we best describe the faith of America's founders, and what impact did their faith have on the government they created? Scholars and popular Christian writers vigorously debate the nature of the founders' faith. Describing their faith is challenging because the founders were a large, diverse group, and because there are a variety of ways to evaluate people's faith. Does it depend primarily on their stated convictions and beliefs, or more on their actions, including their church attendance, devotional activities such as prayer and Bible reading, involvement in parachurch activities, and their conduct? This debate has important ramifications in the current dispute of whether the United States was founded as a distinctly Christian nation, an essentially secular one, or one built upon a variety of philosophical premises, and also over how to interpret the First Amendment. Historians and journalists, including Edwin Gousted, Stephen Wallman, Richard Hughes, David Holmes, and Brooke Allen, argued that the worldview of most founders was strongly shaped by deism and the tenets of the Enlightenment. Historian Frank Lambert, for example, argues that the impact of deism and the Enlightenment on the founding of the American Republic and the relationship between church and state can hardly be overstated. University of Chicago law professor Jeffrey Stone contends that the founding generation viewed religion through an Enlightenment lens that was deeply skeptical of Orthodox Christianity. So what's deism? In a nutshell, deism is a philosophy that was popular in Western intellectual circles in the 17th and 18th centuries that asserts God created the world but does not intervene in it. Its God is the great clockmaker who winds up the world like a clock and then lets it run according to its own laws. Once the process has begun, God is aloof and uninvolved. Therefore, deists do not believe in what we just heard at lunchtime, God's providence, or in prayer. They also deny the authority and value of Scripture and reject many central Christian doctrines, including Christ's deity, atonement for sin, and bodily resurrection. On the other hand, Christian writers such as Peter Marshall Jr., John Eidsmoe, Tim LaHaye, William Federer, and David Barton strongly disagree. They maintain that the United States had a distinctly Christian founding, that almost all the founders were devout Orthodox Christians whose religious convictions shaped their political philosophy. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Many of the founders were indeed Orthodox Christians whose faith was deep, meaningful, and very important to their understanding of how the republic should be constituted. Others were not Trinitarian Christians, but their political philosophy was significantly affected by the Bible and Christian theology. Almost none of them was a deist. So let's examine the facts. Almost every founder, like virtually all Americans in 1776, identified themselves as Christians. Founders were Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Lutherans, Anglicans, Quakers, Catholics, and Unitarians. By almost any measure, many colonists of European descent who settled in the New World were serious Christians, and their constitutions, laws, and practices reflected the influence of Christianity. The founders grew up as members of this culture and were shaped in part by its religious and moral teachings and practices. Many of the founders were probably sincere, devout Christians, but this is difficult for scholars to prove. Even if a founder belonged to and regularly attended a church, even served as a church officer, he may have done so not because of true personal conviction, but simply because it was a social expectation. Numerous founders, who I will mention shortly, embraced and articulated Orthodox Christian tenets, but many founders said little about their religious beliefs, but also the behavior of many founders in their public and private lives was consistent with biblical morality. The founders were also informed by the Anglo-American political legal tradition and their own political experience, and like all humans, were motivated to varying degrees by self, class, or state interests. They were influenced by Lockean liberalism, classical republicanism, and the Scottish Enlightenment. But Christianity had a significant impact on many founders. Lots of evidence indicates that the founders, even those who were not Orthodox Christians, were influenced by Christian ideas. Many who played leading roles in the nation's Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, and devising and ratifying the Constitution were devout Christians, as evident in their church attendance, commitment to prayer and Bible reading, belief in God's direction of earthly affairs, and their conduct. The nation's Orthodox Christian founders included Samuel Adams, who arguably played the most important role in America deciding to declare independence, and later served as governor of Massachusetts; Patrick Henry, a two-time governor of Virginia; John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a co-author of the Federalist Papers, and a governor of New York; Roger Sherman, a member of the Continental Congress and of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate; John Witherspoon, mentioned earlier today, the president of Princeton and the only pastor to sign the Declaration of Independence; Elis Boudinot, a president of the Continental Congress, a member of the U.S. Senate from New Jersey, and the first president of the American Bible Society; Boston merchant John Hancock, who served as governor of Massachusetts; physician Benjamin Rush, we've heard a lot about him today; Oliver Ellsworth, a U.S. senator from Connecticut and the nation's third Supreme Court Chief Justice; George Mason, a Virginia planter and politician; Quaker John Dickinson, who served as president of both Delaware and Pennsylvania; Charles Pinckney, the governor of South Carolina and a U.S. senator; Catholic Charles Carroll, a U.S. senator from Maryland; and Abigail Adams, the wife of the second president and an advocate for women's rights. So here's two examples to document the orthodoxy of these kind of founders. Roger Sherman said, "I believe there is only one living and true God, existing in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the same in substance, equal in power and glory." John Jay said, "Our gracious Creator has provided for us a Redeemer who has made atonement for the sins of the whole world, and thereby reconciling the divine justice with the divine mercy, has opened a way for our redemption and salvation." The claim of some scholars that most founders were strident secularists or devoted deists is patently false. These scholars typically cite Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, George Washington, Thomas Paine, and John Adams to make their case that most founders were deists. The evidence indicates that these men were probably Unitarians rather than Christians, in that they did not view Jesus as divine. However, they all believed that God directed the universe, and they all believed in personal prayer. Two things I said deists don't believe in. Their conviction that God intervened in human affairs and directed history has led some scholars to call these founders warm or enlightened deists, but these terms seem like oxymorons. Arguably, the only two deists among the founders were Ethan Allen, who penned Reason the Only Oracle of Man, and his mentor Thomas Young, who died in 1777, and neither man played any role in the American constitutional order. If I had time, I could give you examples from every one of these key founders that we just mentioned about how they viewed God's providence. But I have time today only to discuss Washington. Throughout his life, he appealed to an all-powerful providence to protect and guide him and the nation, especially in times of crisis. Throughout the War for Independence, the general asked for and acknowledged God's providential guidance and assistance hundreds of times. He told a minister that no one has a more perfect reliance on the all-wise and all-powerful dispensations of the Supreme Being than I have, nor thinks his aid more necessary. The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in this war, he asserted in 1778, that anyone who did not thank God and acknowledge his obligations to him was worse than an infidel. After the war ended, Washington declared, "I attribute all glory to that Supreme Being who has caused the several forces that contributed to America's triumph to harmonize perfectly together. No people had more reason to acknowledge divine interposition in their affairs," he wrote in 1792, "than those of the United States." Now, we heard some great examples of providence at lunchtime today, but let me give you two examples I think are striking. One is that a ragtag colonial army, continental army, defeated the world's mightiest military force in the Revolutionary War. And secondly, that with a population of only 3 million people, the United States had a group of founders whose collective wisdom, political astuteness, and moral convictions have been unmatched in any subsequent historical period. As Calvin Coolidge, who really should be Grove City College's second favorite president after Ronald Reagan. After all, he was John Calvin Coolidge, and he was an ardent fiscal conservative. But anyway, he put it this way, that there would have been gathered together a body of men so learned in that science, by science he meant political science, so experienced in its application, so talented and so wise in its statement and in its demonstration, as those who prepared, formulated, and secured the adoption of the American Constitution will never cease to be the wonder and admiration of the profoundest students of government. He continued, after making every allowance for a fortunate combination of circumstances and the accomplishments of human ingenuity, they have all been nearly forced to come to the belief that it can be accounted for only by the addition of another element, which we recognize as the guiding hand of providence, that we got these men at this time. The faith of the founders was very important to the establishment of the American Republic. They created a government that was hospitable both to Christians and practitioners of other religions. Almost all the hundreds of men who attended the Federal Constitutional Convention of 1787 participated in state ratification conventions, and were elected to the first federal Congress, called themselves Christians. And many of them were indeed influenced by Orthodox Christian ideas in important ways. Numerous founders testified about how Christianity influenced the government they created. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God." The founders asserted that God is the authority, God is the source of all authority, and that humans have dignity because they're created in God's image. We heard that earlier today. And because people are created in God's likeness, they possess the faculty of reason and a capacity for moral discernment. The founders firmly believed that God established moral standards, that legislation should be made in accordance with those standards, and that moral laws took precedence over human laws. The founders spoke eloquently, passionately, and frequently about the importance of religiously grounded morality to the success of the new republic. The founders cared deeply about religion because they thought it promoted character and conduct, which was essential to the republic's flourishing. They thought that upright morality depended on Christian faith and conviction. The founders insisted that religion, by which virtually all of them meant Christianity, was necessary for public happiness and political prosperity. The founders' belief in human sinfulness led them to create a constitutional order that separated powers and provided checks and balances. As James Madison maintained in Federalist 55, there's a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust. In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton argued that the new Constitution would be effective only if its framers took into account the ordinary depravity of man. The founders believed that democracy could survive only if citizens restrained their passions, obeyed a shared moral order, and strove to act virtuously. You're probably familiar with Washington's assertion in his farewell address, which actually was mentioned earlier today. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Or as John Adams put it, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people as wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Benjamin Rush asserted, the gospel of Jesus Christ prescribes the wisest rules for just conduct in every situation of life. And John Hancock proclaimed, sensible of the importance of Christian piety and virtue to the order and happiness of a state, I cannot but earnestly commend to you every measure for their support and encouragement. The founders also stressed the importance of putting the common good before one's own interest. As John Adams argued, government is instituted for the common good, for the protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people, and not for the profit, honor, or private interest of any one man, family, or class of men. The founders saw the common good as including moral and intellectual education of youth, public morality, Sabbath rest, a healthy marriage culture, Republican self-government, the rule of law, and the worship of God according to the dictates of each person's conscience. The founders separated church and state, not because they wanted to exclude Christian principles and values from government and society, but because they wanted to ensure that people could choose to worship as they pleased. This is the most radical feature of the new nation they created. More radical than not having a king or even being a republic. Because other nations at this time had no king, and the Netherlands was already a republic. But every Western nation had an established church from the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 300s all the way up until the 1780s. I don't have time today to discuss Jefferson's famous phrase, a wall of separation, included in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist. But it has been greatly misused by courts, politicians, and pundits since the 1947 Supreme Court case. Note, however, that the day after the House approved the First Amendment in August of 1789, Boudinot proposed that Congress ask President Washington to recommend a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, which he did. Moreover, when the first Congress assembled in 1790, among its initial acts were selecting a chaplain. Apparently they had more money than Michael mentioned at lunch today. And asking Washington to declare a day of thanksgiving. I will point out that Jefferson only used the phrase wall of separation once publicly in his life. Moreover, he issued calls for prayer and fasting when he was governor of Virginia. And in his revision of Virginia statutes, he drafted bills stipulating that the governor could appoint days of public fasting and humiliation or thanksgiving. And as a member of the Continental Congress, he proposed the nation adopt a seal containing the image of Moses extending his hand over the sea, causing it to overwhelm Pharaoh. And the motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. He closed his second inaugural address by encouraging all Americans to join him in seeking the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old. And 2 days after completing his letter to the Danbury Baptist, he attended church services in the U.S. Capitol building, where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist minister and opponent of religious establishments, preach. Doesn't sound exactly like separation of church and state. Their faith led many founders to conclude that religious liberty should be strongly protected. Dozens of examples could be cited, but consider one. In a 1793 letter to the members of Baltimore's new church, Washington expressed his happiness to be living in a country in which every person may worship God according to the dictates of his own heart. Many founders, however, also thought that civic authorities should encourage Christianity, that it was appropriate to use religious language in the public square. They provided government aid to religion in a variety of ways. Individual states could continue to have established churches. Last one of those was in 1833. Restrict public office holding to Christians, public blasphemy, punish blasphemy, a little different than publish it, and issue proclamations of thanksgiving to God and calls for fasting. Federal funds could be used to finance missions to Indians, and government facilities could be used for Christian congregations for worship. In a 1797 proclamation as governor of Massachusetts, Samuel Adams beseeched God to speedily establish the kingdom of God of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ everywhere. The founders believed that Christianity was much more likely to thrive when it was voluntary. Madison argued in his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments that Christianity flourished not only without the support of human laws, but in spite of every opposition from them, not only during periods of miraculous aid, but also long after it had been left to its own evidence and the ordinary care of providence. Moreover, religion would flourish if left alone, he said. It is error alone which needs the support of government, Jefferson declared. Truth can stand by itself. So, in closing, did the founders seek to establish a Christian nation? No. But did they devise a nation whose governmental structure and operations are in many ways consistent with Christian principles and presuppositions? Absolutely. This government, crafted for a country with 3 million people, 90% of whom are farmers, still works remarkably well for a nation of 342 million people, less than 2% of whom are farmers. Strikingly, after the Bill of Rights was ratified, our Constitution has been amended only 17 times. The current effort to exclude religious perspectives and ideals and ensure a naked, ideologically neutral public square is at odds with the founders' view, the history of our country, and the well-being of our society. The founders believed it permissible for national and state governments to encourage Christianity, but this may no longer be prudential in our increasingly pluralistic country. Yet the Constitution does not mandate a secular polity, and we should be wary of jurists, politicians, and academicians who try to strip religion from the public square. So as we celebrate our nation's 250th birthday, let's praise God for these extraordinary founders and their commitment to, or at least openness to, Christian principles and values. Thank you for your time.
Well, that is a tough act to follow. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for that excellent lecture. It is a pleasure to be here, as always. I'm always pleased to be here at Grove City, and particularly at this conference. My talk today is about James Madison and securing independence. And we're doing this, of course, this year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on a specific date, July 4th, 1776. And in some respects, that is the moment that independence happens, but in another sense, in a bigger sense, not exactly. This is what John Adams wrote in retirement. The revolution, he wrote, was effected before war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in the religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. And in a lot of respects, I think you should probably date that moment beginning really with the Boston Tea Party, the reaction of the British to the Boston Tea Party and the American outrage over it. You'd have to look at Lexington and Concord in 1775. And Jefferson in retirement himself said the Declaration was really exactly that, a declaration of principles that already existed. The Declaration is really a statement of the facts on the ground. But of course, the revolution is not secured in 1776. In some respects, it's not secured until 1781 with the defeat of the British at Yorktown. But you could also argue, and I would argue, that it's not actually fully secured until 1801 when Thomas Jefferson peacefully replaces John Adams as the president under the new Constitution. And of course, that happens after the Constitution. So if one of the two signature moments of the revolution is July 4th, 1776, the other one would probably have to be September 17th, 1787, when the draft of the new Constitution is completed. The first date is the declaration of the change. The second one is the production of the instrument of government that will secure the change. And in the latter case, in the Constitution, James Madison was essential. And in fact, I'd argue that in many respects, he was the essential man. You know, it's interesting if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. and gone to the Jefferson Memorial. It's a remarkable testament to the Jeffersonian legacy. You won't find any such sort of high-flown statues of James Madison. He has a statue in the Library of Congress where he's seated. But of course, Jefferson's glory in that moment is really the product, at least in part, of the hard, disciplined work that James Madison undertook to make those high-flying declarations of principle a reality. And in fact, if you've ever been to Monticello and looked at Jefferson's epitaph, it says, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." In all three of those Jeffersonian accomplishments, you see Madison effectuating them on the ground. Madison was the essential man in the Constitutional Convention. It was Madison's efforts in the 1780s to enact Jefferson's Statute on Religious Freedom, and it was Madison who was the second president of the University of Virginia. So let's think about this. Madison is younger than Jefferson. He's younger than Washington and Adams. Jefferson is born in 1743. Adams is born in the 1730s. Washington is in the 1720s. Madison is born in 1751, so he's younger. He comes to the Continental Congress in 1780, where he served for 3 years. He was just 29 years old when he begins his time there, so he's very young. What he saw when he got to Philadelphia with the Continental Congress, or you could call it the Confederation Congress. What the reality is that after independence was declared, the Second Continental Congress basically became a continuing body. So it's basically the Congress that runs until the new Constitution. What he saw there were petty squabbles that paralyzed Congress. States were pursuing local advantages at national expense, and a complete absence of statesmen. In fact, you see petty politicians like Arthur Lee actually attacking Benjamin Franklin. I mean, can you imagine attacking Benjamin Franklin when he's over in Paris? But that was what was happening. Attacking Robert Morris as well. The Articles of Confederation, which was the first national instrument of government, didn't just deny power to Congress, which it did. It also gave too much power to irresponsible state governments. State governments were printing paper money, creating inflation, but not just sort of a managed inflation like when we think about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. I mean, flooding the market with paper bills, essentially nullifying private contracts between debtors and creditors. They were defying the peace treaty with Great Britain by seizing the property of loyalists. By the time Madison leaves Congress, they are beginning to slap tariffs on each other's goods, and they're violating the rights of citizens within those states. And this, by the middle of the 1780s, evolves into a full-blown crisis that becomes known as Shays' Rebellion. And it's really interesting to see the panicked letters. You can find them online at the National Archives, but panicked letters, even George Washington. We think about George Washington as being this unflappable great man who was completely confident in the success of the revolution. All of that is true, but at the same time, his private letters, express a real alacrity that all of their gains are becoming undone by, frankly, the mob of ruffians in the Massachusetts backcountry. And the unspoken fear in 1786 is that maybe those European aristocrats were right. Maybe the people can't govern themselves. See, what the Americans are doing at this point is they're not just operating within the political moment that they're in. They're part of a larger conversation that goes all the way back to classical antiquity with the ancient Greeks and runs through the Enlightenment period in which they are then operating. This question about government and this essential problem of government, that human beings need government because they can't spontaneously produce justice on their own. They're too selfish. At the same time, government has to be run by human beings. So it's a paradox that doesn't admit of a clear answer. As Madison put it, and I'm paraphrasing here, how do you get the government to control the citizenry, but also to control itself? Now, not everybody had such a negative view of human nature. Thomas Jefferson, for one, had a more positive view of human nature. Thomas Paine did as well. But these are minority views, and I should emphasize, too, sort of amplifying what Dr. Smith was saying, this is a profoundly Christian morality. Right? Or I should say a profoundly Christian moral anthropology. What they're talking about here, even though they're not using the language of it, they're talking about the concept of original sin. So how do we deal with this? How do we get human beings who are inherently selfish but need community to put aside their selfishness and live in community with one another? Well, there were two inherited solutions that were sort of on the menu at the time of the founding. The first was a small republic where the citizenry alone ruled in some fashion, usually through a series of rules and regulations. Venice is an example. Venice is still a republic in 1787, so that would be one illustration. The Florentine Republic, which had already fallen, but the Florentine Republic produced this sort of great proliferation of political thought, that would be another solution. And the idea behind these is that the political thinkers that sort of investigated these carefully noted the homogeneity of the community and also an emphasis on civic virtue. So that'd be one solution. Another solution would be something closer to what the British had at the time of 1787. Not Great Britain of today, where there is a king and House of Lords and Commons, but the Commons runs everything, but an actual separation of power between three distinct units: the king, the aristocracy, and the lords, and just sort of the average, the Commons, which would be sort of the middling landowners, right? The idea here is that the lords, the aristocrats, and the sort of the smaller landowners sort of are checks on one another, with the king being above everybody else. This, what would be known as mixed government. As far as Madison is concerned, and as far as the mainstream of political thought in the United States is concerned, both of these ideas are off the table. Again, not uniform. If you look at John Adams, for instance, one of the reasons why John Adams had such a miserable presidency is because he's off in England and he's writing sort of out of touch with the currents of American political thought, and he's writing in defense of mixed estates. But there is a general sentiment towards a republican system, which is different than a democracy. A republican system relies upon popular sovereignty, but that popular sovereignty has to be channeled through good institutions to prevent democratic tyranny. So what do we do here? I mean, the problem the Americans have is that obviously we're not going back to a monarchy. We're not going to, bring back one of George III's idiot sons over to run our country. If you know anything about the children of George, his sons were all idiots, right? So we're not bringing back this future William IV. That's not going to happen. But the other problem is that, if you look at the 13 states, they sort of modeled that Venetian, Florentine idea of a small republic, and it hadn't worked. So what do? We need something new. Well, this is where Madison brings in a really novel, interesting, and profoundly important idea. What he basically does is inverts the conventional wisdom. He doesn't do this all by de novo. He relies a lot on the Scottish Enlightenment and David Hume, but he builds out this idea that the idea of small republics is exactly backwards. Republics, we have to go big. Republics are more stable when they're large and they're diverse. That's his essential argument. And his thinking here is that in a small republic, one faction or one group of selfish individuals who all have a similar interest can amount to a numerical majority. When that happens, they'll run the whole show in a republic, because the Republican principle is that the majority rules. But in a larger, more diverse, or what Madison calls an extended republic, such factions are going to be less likely to form. Right? There will be a multitude of factions. And without a sort of a dominant faction, what's going to happen is they're going to have to meet, they're going to have to negotiate, they're going to have to compromise, there's going to be bargaining, talking, jawboning, politicking. And in that process of politicking, Madison thinks, we're going to get something closer to a final result of public policy that is actually fair. We're going to get something that approaches what we could call the general welfare, the public interest, the common good. That's Madison's big idea. Now, Madison is not simply an idea man, although he certainly is. But Madison, I like to think of Madison not so much as a political philosopher, but I like to call him an enlightenment man of politics. So he doesn't leave us a systematic treatise of political thought, like something that you could take and compare to, say, Aristotle's Politics. That's just not who he is. He's engaged in the political process, and he's actually, by this point, in 1787, he's 36 years old. He's a very, very smart, practiced politician. And so what he does is he comes to Philadelphia, where the convention's meeting. He's come early, and he comes with a plan of government that becomes known as the Virginia Plan, and he lines up support from both the Virginia delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation. And so when the convention convenes at the end of May 1787, here's the plan. That's a very important example of setting the agenda, because when the Constitutional Convention was called by the Continental Congress, it just said, come up with solutions that will make the Articles of Confederation effective. That's all it said. It didn't really say anything. So the convention could have gone in any number of directions, except Madison comes in, and through Edmund Randolph, who's the governor of Virginia, Madison gives a plan to Randolph. Randolph says, here's a plan, let's talk about this. And what the plan is a truly national system of government. And it ends up setting the agenda for the first half of the convention. Madison ends up giving 167 speeches at the convention. He makes 72 motions. He serves on 4 committees. And by the way, we know so much about this because while he's doing all of these things, he's taking careful notes during the convention. And then he goes home in the evening and he's turning his shorthand notes into actual working notes. He has to be, besides Alexander Hamilton, it's hard to think of anybody in this period who's a harder working, he really is sort of like we would today call him a workaholic, right? And importantly, though, he loses on a lot of things. He hates the Senate as it ends up coming out. Equal representation of the Senate, for him, is a violation of his core principle. The Congress should reflect the national political mood. The Senate's not going to do that. He also wants to give Congress a veto on state laws because he thinks the states have been the problem. He doesn't get that either. And in fact, by September, when the convention's wrapping up business, he's writing private letters to Jefferson saying, this thing stinks. It's not going to work. And it's not going to work because they didn't listen to me, is basically his argument. So, and also we have to remember as well, you can't just say, oh, this is Madison's show. It's really not. I mean, when you think about the Senate, which ends up being an essential institution in the American constitutional order, you have to acknowledge the influence of John Dickinson from Delaware, of Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. When Madison also, his initial draft is basically to give Congress power to do anything that it thinks it needs to do. Well, that gets changed too by John Rutledge of South Carolina. The preamble to the Constitution was written by Gouverneur Morris. Madison, as a member of Congress, when he proposes the Bill of Rights, actually wants to put a preamble in front of Morris's preamble, which is, I think, probably one of his worst ideas in his entire political career. Can you imagine taking that beautiful preamble, "We the people of the United States," and making it the second opening line? It's a terrible idea. Right? And of course, George Washington's mere presence there keeps everybody behaving themselves. Only the New York delegation leaves, but for the most part, everybody sticks around. See, what Madison's real contribution here is to begin and introduce this idea of a truly national framework. Right? Not just national powers like the power to tax, but also a national political frame of reference. The people of the United States. And it's really what the Constitution creates that hadn't existed before, right? If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's the declaration of these 13 states. The Constitution declares we the people of the United States. It was really Madison who first introduced this idea at the convention, and it's Madison who, in my judgment, makes the most persuasive argument for why creating a national political community is a good thing. Right? And Madison also goes on, he writes about a third of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton writes most of them. The essays are intended to sort of influence the New York, each state was to call a ratifying convention, which would be elected, so it was meant to influence the elections to the New York ratifying convention. They don't work on that level. New York's ratification convention is very anti-federalist. But what happens is that supporters of the Constitution begin sharing these essays up and down the continent, and they become influential that way. And then after the new government is founded, they become this sort of fundamental, almost authoritative commentary on the meaning of the Constitution. I mean, they sort of serve in the same kind of way that the Pauline epistles serve as a commentary on the Gospels. It's sort of like, if you want to understand exactly what this is, you look to the Federalist Papers. Right? I'd point out, too, that ratification is immensely close, and it speaks to the last sort of contribution that Madison makes here. Right? It passes through a number of small states very quickly, but it's very close in Massachusetts. New Hampshire, they thought that New Hampshire would ratify it easily, but the New Hampshire ratifying convention decides to adjourn because they the delegates start talking to each other, realize that their voters had told them to vote against it, and so they adjourn to sort of go back to their constituents and make the case for the Constitution. There's more than 200 delegates at the Virginia ratifying convention. The final margin, the ratification wins by 10 votes. That's it. I mean, it's an incredibly close-run thing, and it really requires a final compromise, which is hammered out in Massachusetts. And again, this is sort of where you need to think beyond just Madison. It's a final compromise that's really sort of endorsed by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, both of whom were skeptical of the Constitution but thought something had to be done. And the compromise was, they called it recommendatory amendments. The Anti-Federalists said, we need a second convention, or we need to, the Anti-Federalist opponents of the Constitution said, well, we'll ratify the Constitution only if you make these changes. And Madison and supporters of the Constitution recognized that was just a way to kill the Constitution without actually being the one to shoot the bullet to kill it. So what they settled upon was recommendatory amendments. So what happens is Massachusetts says, we ratify the Constitution, no strings attached. Here's a list of amendments. Think about making these changes. And so that's the final deal that sort of gets the document across the finish line. New Hampshire does that, South Carolina does that, Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, they all do that. And so when the new Congress convenes, there's this big stack of proposed changes, and guess who's there to make sure that, this deal is made good? It's James Madison. Madison had not been in favor of a Bill of Rights, frankly. He thought it was dangerous. If you start listing the rights of the people, future governments are going to think that those are the only rights that the people have. Or if you don't do a good job in listing them, future governments will use loopholes and misunderstandings. So Madison actually thought, if you want to secure the rights of the people, you need a well-designed government. Right? But Madison recognizes people are expecting a Bill of Rights. We have to make this happen. And so Madison actually, in the first Congress, you would think, and when I was doing research for my biography on Madison, I thought, well, here we go. There's going to be some great high-level debate over like the Due Process Clause in the first Congress. There's nothing like that. Most of the first Congress is filled with like Federalists who don't want a Bill of Rights either. They're like, oh, we got to write the tax law. We got to organize the State Department. We got to do the courts. We don't need to do this. Let's give the new government a chance to succeed. Madison is insistent, sort of annoying his fellow members of Congress, like, we promised that we would do this, let's do it. And Madison's initial draft of the Bill of Rights is, for the most part, just adopted with very little debate. All right? And so when we think about all of this, we take all of this up, it's a really remarkable phenomenon, which is that for how hotly contested the Constitution was in 1787 and 1788, it was the extent to which the people just accepted it and adopted it and thought of it as the foundational charter it was remarkable. Even as party politics reaches like a fevered pitch in the 1790s between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, both sides say the other guys are the ones who are violating the Constitution, right? So they both agree that the Constitution is inviolable. So it's a really remarkable accomplishment. And when you go through each of these steps, you see like the same guy. It's James Madison. He's not the father of the Constitution in the same way that Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. But like I said, he's the essential player across the entire affair. I mean, Hamilton wrote, for instance, this is a good illustration. Hamilton writes more Federalist essays than Madison. But Hamilton was gone for huge stretches of the convention, right? It's Madison who is there at every step along the way. So how then, to put the matter simply, Madison and the founders secured the revolution. They secured Jefferson's lofty, we hold these truths to be self-evident, by creating a government that embodied the ideals of this Jeffersonian declaration, but that was stable, that was flexible, and that was durable. And the Declaration has no meaning or value unless a government that embodies its principles can actually endure. And we have lived under that form of government for 237 years, which is truly remarkable. And every year that the Constitution remains in force, the scope, the breadth, the genius of this massive achievement becomes ever more amazing. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions here, and we'll just raise your hand, and Maddie will bring the mic to you.
Hi there. Thank you guys so much for coming in today. Really appreciate you. Random question for you guys. A lot of people ascribe the start of America, and especially around our 250th anniversary, as July 4th, 1776. Signing of the Declaration, nice round number. However, you spoke about how America didn't really become America until around 1801 after Adams' administration. I'm wondering, when do you guys think that our modern version of America, with the modern view on the American dream, when do you think that really started?
Well, you can posit all kinds of different dates for when the concept of America began. Not sure about the concept of the American dream, but a lot of people look to as early as the Pilgrims. A lot of people look as early as John Winthrop and his famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, with the whole idea of America being this new idea, this new blessed place, the new Israel of God. There are just so many different places. As was mentioned, the revolution occurred in the hearts of people before the Revolutionary War occurred, and without that transformation in their hearts, they wouldn't have been successful in winning the Revolutionary War, arguably. So we've had a lot of stops and starts. We've had a lot of new beginnings over the course of our history, but I would be very reluctant to say that there's one period that we could definitively say.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when we think about the American dream, I mean, what is the American dream? The American dream, I would argue, and I guess people could disagree, but the American dream is basically this idea that if you work hard and you're frugal and you're prudent and you are responsible, you can be successful. And so when we think about that, what is that? It's in the past now, but I would argue that what that is in relation to was European civilization, particularly European medievalism, which, took a long time to fade away. And so in that respect, I would say that America, at least as we conceive it as the American dream, you could probably date it probably to 1607, right? Probably to the first colony itself, because that's what it was. I mean, Jefferson argued that in his summary view of the rights of British Americans, which was that that Europeans came here and started to do something new, unfettered by the rules and the hierarchy of European traditions, and it's still a fundamental ethos of America, even if the reference point of European medievalism is a thing of the past.
And the average European never got more than 25 miles away from home, and with 99% chance he was going to do what his parents did. So in that sense, America was a land of great opportunity.
Yeah.
I was wondering, the Continental Congress had 5 or 6 presidents, the Continental Congress, and James Madison was president twice.
No, Madison was never president of the Continental Congress.
Oh, he wasn't?
No, he was not.
Well, anyways, how did all that, well, we know that they changed it to the other part, but how do you think the people that were the primary principles of that affected what went on later on for writing the Constitution?
Well, for the most part, the lessons and experiences of the Continental Congress were lessons about what not to do. It was almost entirely negative instructions. There was very little. The only really meaningful thing that the Continental Congress ever really managed to do was to resolve the disputes over the Western lands, which is a huge accomplishment, and established the precedent that the Western lands would be held in common for the United States, but also created the foundation for what later would become the Missouri Compromise and the idea of free soil with the Northwest Ordinance. But beyond that, there was very little. And in fact, there were efforts to reorganize the Continental Congress even during the Congress, recognizing that Congress was not a good institution for the management of public finance, so Robert Morris becomes the superintendent of finance. And Congress, because anytime there was anything that had to be decided, it would go to Congress, and then they'd have to form committees, and it was just a mess. I mean, if you've ever been in meetings that seemed to drag on forever, that's what this was, right, for like 15 years. So it was predominantly negative lessons, and I would say maybe the biggest negative lesson from that experience was we need a central, singular executive to manage certain core tasks like the military, like the negotiation of foreign affairs, like public finance, things like that. Hugely important.
I would just add, for the first half of its existence, they were fighting a war on their own soil against, as I said, the world's mightiest military power, and they were undermanned and underfinanced. So they had a lot on their plate the first half of their time, certainly.
I feel like we have a tremendous political discord in this country and Congress right now. As I look back, I remember Reagan and Tip O'Neill disagreeing, but then getting together for a drink afterwards and tolerating each other and enjoying the friendship. I have heard that Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson were vigorously opposed in ideas to one another. I wonder if you have any background on that to explain how that might have compared back then with what we have right now in this country.
That sounds like a question for a political scientist.
Well, my favorite, just to put, the current political discontents in context, my single favorite letter from the founding is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison in the mid-1780s and said, complaining about Patrick Henry, who by then was governor of Virginia, and saying, I believe we have to pray earnestly for his death. And it's interesting as well, you would think that, Hamilton dies at the hands of Aaron Burr in 1804. And you would, the general sort of rule is, you don't speak ill of the dead. John Adams must never have heard that. Because in pretty much every letter in retirement to anybody who would bring Alexander Hamilton up, he was like, Hamilton was a madman. That was Adams's explanation, is that Hamilton went insane. And fortunate for Adams that he was not around to see the musical Hamilton, because it would have been a very bitter pill for Adams to swallow. So the lesson is, I think we can bemoan the present age and the present moment, but I think we have to remember that these individuals were human beings. They were remarkable human beings, but they were still human beings, and they were susceptible to all of the same passions and vices and appetites that we have. And in some cases, they had them more. Adams was a remarkable human being. And Adams knew that he was a remarkable human being. And so that led to the vice of just supreme, overwhelming vanity, which is what a lot of these men had. They were very vain. And when you get vain men in disagreements with one another, they're going to wish earnestly that the other one would just drop dead.
They never had a lower rating than cockroaches, though, like our current Congress has had. So,
I think that'll wrap us up here. If you give these two gentlemen a round of applause.